is Dr. Stephen Greer, and this is Conversations with Dr. Greer, and I'm joined today with all of you by Dr. Ted Loder, who's our science advisor for the OrionProject.org. And today we're going to be talking about an in-depth overview of the history of very advanced energy systems for the past really over 100 years, and the kinds of things that have happened that have caused them not to be able to reach the market that has resulted in the current geophysical and environmental and geopolitical crisis that we're facing. And this is going to be sort of the big overview so people get a sense of where we have gone in the past, and also to outline really how these technologies have vanished into the passage of time. And I really call this the missing century, that we have about 100 years of our civilization's evolution, not just technologically, but societally, socially, environmentally, economically, that has been lost due to the vast economic interest and the energy cartels and industrialists who have not wanted this information out, and why it is such a large strategic problem for any inventor or scientist who comes across this new physics to bring something out to the world, and why that's one of the key specialties that the OrionProject.org brings to this discussion. So thank you, Dr. Loder, for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Good. Well, I don't know if you'd like to just, because I know you've studied a great deal the work of Dr. Thomas Bearden and others, and the historical overviews that exist, and if you'd like to sort of summarize those for the audience for a few moments.
I'll be glad to. It's interesting. Really, these issues begin nearly 150 years ago, and that's when Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell in the 1860s. Interestingly enough, Michael Faraday was an experimentalist, a brilliant experimentalist and observationalist, and observed and did experiments, very careful experiments, and kind of discovered how magnetism interacts with wires, how electricity was produced, and he kind of laid the basic experimental foundation to which then James Maxwell was able to put some very brilliant set of equations describing what Michael Faraday had observed.
Right.
And so during the 1860s, early 60s, a series of papers published by Maxwell describing what Faraday had found and basically laying down the basic set of concepts about magnetism and electricity. Now, the interesting thing is that by later on, and included in his equations, which were in a quaternion form, which is a more complex form of way of writing equations used then that are presently used today. Interestingly, in Maxwell's equations, he had included a negative energy and asymmetric energy, asymmetric equations, which included this negative energy, which indeed is the source of, quote, free energy. Now, by the late 1800s, a fellow by the name of Lorentz, Heinrich Lorentz, in 1899, well, early on in early 1890s, and then in 1899 and 1904, was hired basically or encouraged by J.P. Morgan to symmetricize or make the equations symmetrical as opposed to asymmetrical. The asymmetrical nature of the equations allowed for this excess free energy to be available if you knew how to use the equations. Lorentz simplified the equations, making them symmetrical. Part of that work had already been done with the man by the name of Heaviside, but by the late 1800s, early 1900s, with the encouragement of J.P. Morgan, who wanted to guarantee, to quote Tom Bearden's comments about this, J.P. Morgan wanted to guarantee that none of the confounded Tesla systems, that's Nikola Tesla he's referring to, freely taking and using electromagnetic energy from the active medium would ever be developed for future electrical engineering. In other words, by essentially crippling the equations of Maxwell and changing their form, he essentially eliminated the knowledge or information about this excess energy. And basically, since the birth of electrical engineering, which was early 1900s, late 1800s with Tesla, the world's electrical engineers have thought, designed, developed, and implemented only symmetrical electrical systems, which basically require us to continually to put energy in to turn the turbine, whether we're using coal-fired plants or steam generators or waterfalls or people power or horsepower, turning a turbine, fighting against the magnetic fields within it to produce electricity. And so engineers have never been allowed, if you will, or even know how to build a proper asymmetrical system which would extract this essentially free energy. So that's essentially where things have been since the early 1900s. Now, it's interesting that
But I think what's important to point out here and what you've shared is the degree to which academia and research is all founded on a false, not just theoretical, but actually a mathematical basis because of this corruption which occurred over 100 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. And it's the depressing thing is that people such as Tesla and other scientists, some of the other scientists at that time, knew of this energy availability and basically based their technologies on it. In fact, Tesla, in a great quote that's been quoted many times but is worthwhile repeating here, Tesla said that the following: "Ere many generations past, our machinery will be driven by a power obtainable at any point in the universe." He was referring to this free energy issue. This idea is not novel. We find it a delightful myth of Entheus, who derives the power from the earth. We find it among the subtle speculations of one of your splendid mathematicians. Throughout space, there is energy. Is this energy static or kinetic? If it is static, our hopes are in vain. If kinetic, and this we know it is for certain, it is a mere question of time when men will succeed in attaching their machinery to the very wheelwork of nature. So he knew about this. In fact, in his research, in his technology, he was actually utilizing these technologies. But as I noted earlier, J.P. Morgan, who was Tesla's backer, as Westinghouse was also involved in it, basically encouraged these folks to destroy that knowledge or remove it from the common engineering availability.
Right, I was going to mention Westinghouse had a key part in it, and I understand also that because of the power of old man Rockefeller, the original Rockefeller, that of course of Standard Oil, that there was a discussion in those circles about this and concern that if this was legitimized or allowed to be known, of course, it would be a whole new industrial system that would not require the suppliers and supply line of fossil fuel energy, whether it be coal or oil or gas or gasoline or what have you.
And so here we are today, 150 years later, basically using the same set of concepts that Tesla developed, but remained static. In other words, it wasn't developed since there. It's interesting that even by the 1930s, when physicists were looking at various new theories in physics, Einstein was very active, Heisenberg, Pauli, and Dirac, and others. That was the golden age of development of physics. In 1934, a thoroughly frightened physics leadership, including Heisenberg and Pauli, strongly and deliberately forced an inappropriate removal of negative energy from Dirac's theory. In other words, Paul Dirac, had figured out this negative energy as well and included in some of his equations, and these other physicists essentially jumped up and down on him to make him remove this information. And later, another physicist who's written about this extensively states that if one had to point to a single place where science went profoundly and permanently off the track, it would have been in 1934, and the emasculation of Dirac's equations, which included this negative energy. So it wasn't just J.P. Morgan at that time. It was a set of peoples encouraging physics to not admit the existence of this technology or the implications that it made and had.
Right. That's correct. And I think one of the things to remember with this is that this kind of chicanery goes on up into the present hour in recent modern history of that we have very good intelligence on. I have personally met with a scientist in Washington, D.C., who is actually a very staunch conservative Republican, but he had worked with a group of people that included Ken Shoulders with his charged cluster array sort of system, which had been found to have an over-unity effect in terms of energy, but more importantly, in terms of what they were interested in at the Department of Energy at the time, the ability to take, at least at that time, because they didn't have access to high-level nuclear waste, low-level nuclear or radioactive material, and actually alter it so that it would become inert and not radioactive through this system, and that this had been reproduced by a Japanese scientist and physicist and by a team of scientists at the University of Illinois. And they had presented these findings to then Clinton Department of Energy Secretary Richardson, who, as you all know, ran for president in the last presidential election but did not win. And Richardson was so excited about this that they actually issued I forget the amount, but it was a multi-million-dollar grant for them to then take it a step further with higher-level radioactive material and neutralize that material. And when that was actually issued, when that grant was announced and published, the physicists who with the American Physical Society and a guy named Dr. Parks at the University of Maryland and others who have an interest in maintaining the status quo of the understanding of physics that is extant, circle the wagons, is what I was told, and circle the limousines, and put so much political pressure on the Department of Energy that Richardson withdrew the grant after it had already been published, which is virtually unheard of because of this political pressure from people who did not want to see this research go forward. Now, when I talked to this man, I believe it was about 2 years ago, maybe less, he said that they were really very shocked about this because at the time, if you remember in the media, there was all this brouhaha and still exists about the Yucca Mountain facility in Nevada, where we're spending billions of dollars to develop a facility to store all the nuclear waste from nuclear power plants. And this would, if developed properly, enable all that waste to be essentially rendered inert without having to go into these multi-billion-dollar storage schemes, which many people have said, look, are not going to be safe because that material is going to be radioactive for thousands of years, and with earthquakes and everything else, and containers being breached and opened, and water tables being contaminated eventually, who can say how long that facility would actually be of any use in terms of truly protecting humanity or the Earth's environment from all this toxicity. And so there was all this excitement that this was a potential huge breakthrough in physics and also in this whole multi-billion-dollar taxpayer-funded boondoggle of storing radioactive waste. And yet here within recent history, we have a firsthand account of that breakthrough being actively suppressed by interests who did not want to have the basic physics and the conventional wisdom in physics today challenged.
Yes, and just to go back to a bit of history, these technologies keep being rediscovered by scientists. And I go back to Paul Dirac just for a moment. He figured out how to get this negative energy from the quantum vacuum state by essentially putting small energy sharp gradient pulses, such as radio frequent pulses, he described them as ticklers, if you will, to sort of hit the system. And the negative energy, when that happens, flows into our system, if you will, our positive system. This energy can basically create negative probabilities and essentially deconstruct or unhappen such things as radioactive materials.
Right.
Now, Ken Shoulders, in his donuts of electron energy that he creates, is doing just that.
Right.
And so by doing that, he's creating some negative energy, which can essentially unhappen or cause to disappear the radioactive material. And that's brilliant. It doesn't require storing for thousands or millions of years of very toxic materials, but it would just slowly uncreate it, if you will. And yet this was known and talked about in the 30s.
Right. Right, and here we sit 75 years later,
yes,
in 2009, with all this toxic nuclear waste, but also all of the power plants. And one of the things that when people think that some of what we're proposing sounds extremely futuristic and all that, I said, well, it's really back to the future. That in fact that for 100 years there have been really rather amazing breakthroughs in electromagnetic physics and engineering and operational devices that have met this buzzsaw of both active suppression and corruption, and that this is not an urban myth, and that here we are still using for over 50% of our electric power in the United States coal-fired power plants, which is exactly what we were using in the mid-1800s as we were chucking coal into steam engines going across and conquering the West. And so there's been this sort of arresting of human civilization and development and evolution technologically by these large vested interests. And when to give people an idea of how large these interests are and how powerful they are, you have to understand that if you take into consideration not just the electric utilities and the power and the gasoline and Exxon and all these, but the financial markets, the petrodollar, for example, and the derivatives markets, what are called futures and commodities, where you trade on the actual assets that are traded for oil and gas and coal and every other commodity. If you add all this up, you're talking about several $100 trillion in financial assets, and that's what they're protecting. And that what has to be understood is that it's going to take a lot of people coming forward supporting the concept of a very bold departure from the way we're living on the earth today and the science behind the way we're living to make this change. And it isn't as if it is an impossible thing to do. I mean, Dr. Loder and I have met many people who, and in fact, one person in particular that I'm thinking of right now, or two, that have worked in classified projects, who have built these systems and worked on these systems, but who are being prevented from coming forward with them. And the thing that's most disturbing about that is that we have a new administration that's calling for bold change and transformative change and a, quote, new energy economy. I mean, the language is lifted right from the Orion Project briefing papers, except they're funding silly things like clean coal and other kind of boondoggles where, I mean, let's say that you can make clean coal burn cleanly without any pollution. To acquire the coal, you're blowing up all of the Blue Ridge and Appalachian Mountains with what's called mountaintop removal, where they simply blow up the mountain to get at the coal veins, the veins of coal that are in there, and which is a huge holocaust going on right now today as I speak, not far from where I'm living here in Virginia, near the University of Virginia. So unfortunately, even if you burn it in a clean way, which has never been proven to be done, to get the coal out of the ground is a catastrophe. And so there are all these pseudo-solutions that are pushed onto the public and onto policymakers and through the Senate and Congress and the White House. And I think that people need to stand up and contact their representatives and senators and the president and say, look, wait a minute, you need to look at the science that Dr. Loder and Dr. Greer and Dr. Bearden and others have pointed out, and at least provide some seed funding. I mean, even if we don't get the whatever it is, 13 or 14 billion that they're wanting to put into clean coal. If we had 3 or 4 million even to have an R&D facility here near the University of Virginia, we could put some of these geniuses together who are still living, who have done this work, and come out with some prototypes. But unfortunately, at this point, we have not been provided that level of funding, and there's billions of dollars in the stimulus bill going into energy projects, but none of the money, not a dime, are going into these things that are really big breakthrough technologies.
Yeah, I'd like to add a comment on that. The ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects funded by in energy, funded by this present administration, has required or sent out a letter for people putting in proposals for breakthrough energy technologies.
Right.
And the Orion Project was submitted to, along with thousands and thousands of other people. The odds are pretty slim. They only had $150 million or so in this first round, and not sure who got the nod on this, but it wasn't us, because we were talking about some of this other technology that we've talked about. Now, the interesting and rather depressing thing, actually, and I literally got an email today from a fellow talking about this, is that the ARPA-E continues with its series of targeted workshops. The targeted workshops for October in early November deal with grid-scale energy storage, direct solar fuel technologies, carbon capture and conversion, energy storage for vehicles, waste heat recovery, and solid-state lighting. This is basically conventional, moving forward by small increments, conventional technologies, conventional way of doing business. So in spite of the fact that it's called Advanced Research Projects and for Energy Technologies, it truly is not doing breakthrough technology.
No, it is
and
not.
It's very depressing, actually, because we were afraid of that.
It's the basic science that they're dealing with are all very, very old science and actually rather conventional, as you mentioned. And the other problem with it is that it's too little too late, because we know that with 7 billion people on the planet now, and with India and China with 2.5 billion people industrializing at 8 and 10% a year, off of trying to use coal-fired power plants and this sort, that the kind of tiny baby steps and incrementalism that's being presented is, I think, really a smokescreen that is the fact that they really don't want the basic solutions to come out, because they'd have to take on these big special interests and these vast, powerful interests. And that's true of what's going on now with the current administration, but also the Bush administration, the Clinton, all the way back for 100 years. I mean, there's plenty of accountability to go around, and this is why the OrionProject.org, you can contribute to that organization and help us build up a fund independent of the government to open our own research and development program, because you can't do it with a few $1,000s. I mean, the equipment just to outfit the laboratory would be several $100,000. But what we have got to do is find a way of funding this kind of basic science research and put it into some applied settings under a secure, and we'll get to this in a moment, strategically secure setting, so that it doesn't meet the fate of the literally hundreds, if not thousands, of inventions that have come along since the early 1900s with Stubblefield and Tesla and Townsend Brown and all the rest. And in fact, we have just learned from a very good friend of the project that Ted Loder and I both know quite well, who has actually worked his whole career in the oil industry, but is very, very supportive of what we're trying to do. And this gentleman has provided us some information on a now expired patent from a physicist who had developed a system very similar to what Stan Meyer had developed, where he was getting hydrogen and oxygen out of water with relatively small amounts of input power due to the specific resonance and frequency and voltages and what have you of the electronic signal going into the system that would then dissociate H2O into two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom, and that he was able, or so the patent claimed, to run a vehicle on this directly. And if true, and if this can be reproduced, then this would be a very big breakthrough. So we know that, and this apparently was developed in the 70s. Well, now that's about 35 years ago, so a third of a century later. Why don't we know about this, and why aren't our cars running on the wastewater from our showers and sinks in our homes, which is wasted anyway? I mean, you see what I'm saying? So these are fundamental questions that have to be asked, and we have to say that the only way we're going to get a solution is to have enough support from somewhere, whether it's an environmental foundation or some philanthropic group, or from the masses of people who are listening to this interview who say, gee whiz, this is ridiculous. I'm going to send in $10 or $50 or $100 or whatever it is to the OrionProject.org and see if we can't get up to their goal. I think we have a $3.1 million budget to open a facility here to bring a dozen or so of these most brilliant engineers and physicists together, and the right equipment and facility, and get working on these things. The problem with it coming any other way, and that is, an individual working alone, is that it's a very steep hill to climb scientifically, but it's also very common that such people, if they do have something like this that works, have already been approached and told not to proceed. We have recently learned, for example, that one of the inventions that Stan Meyer had a national security order on it. And
that's right, and it was just not, he didn't speak about it and was not allowed to push it forward.
Correct, and we have actually seen this thing, and now, of course, the Stan Meyer collection, since he passed away 11 years ago now, is in the hands of some heirs who are still talking to a whole lot of different groups, and we have no idea if the Orion Project will be able to acquire that collection. But whatever it is that Stan Meyer did, we have recently found out there was another scientist who did something very similar. And so, one of the nice things about the laws of nature is that they are universal. And as Dr. Loder mentioned a moment ago, we find that there is this recurring theme of discovery of these sorts of effects and in the electromagnetic realm, because even
you can't keep a good idea down.
You can't keep a good idea down and keep coming forward. The problem is that they continue to emerge and then hit this strategic buzzsaw, which has a multi-$100 trillion interest group wanting to say, like bloody hell, this is going to come out. And so only part of the problem is scientific. The other part of the problem is strategic, political, and social. And this is why the OrionProject.org is such an important vehicle, because it's empowering the public, first of all, to learn of these things, but then secondly, to actively fund them outside of a big governmental or corporate entity, where if they were to be developed at the Department of Energy or in a big corporation or university lab, they almost certainly would be hit with a national security order and then suppressed. Now, the question that's been asked to me is that, well, wouldn't that happen to the Orion Project? And I'd say it might. But if it did, all I would do is go on into the world's media, like we did with the Disclosure Project, and have 1 billion people see me tear that national security order up in front of 1 billion people and dare them to arrest me. I mean, this is precisely the kind of person I am, people who know me. So
that's true.
There will be no intimidation of me on this matter. And if they try, they're going to be rather surprised at what happens in the aftermath, because they're the ones who will end up at Leavenworth for high crimes and treason against the United States. So I think that what we have to do is vow not only to develop these things, but then strategically be independent of the siren call of greed from people who want to buy it out and suppress it, or fear. It's this whole thing of fear and greed, these lower emotions that tend to drive our civilization into all kinds of problems, and that both individually and as a groups of individuals, and that we have to rise above that and be truly spirit warriors and fearless, but also be above the allure of tens of millions or more dollars that are often provided. I remember Dr. Bearden once telling me about a man that he knew personally who had developed one of these electromagnetic generators, and the man, it was the real McCoy. He had tested it, and then the man vanished. And the next time he saw him, the guy was wearing Armani suits and driving Lamborghinis or very fancy cars, and he basically couldn't talk about it any further. He had been given a wad of money, and the device had gone onto a black shelf somewhere. And we have seen this happen. I have seen it happen. So between threats and inducements, carrots and sticks, most people sell out. And that's part of the tragedy of the last 100 years, but it's also very instructive in terms of what we have to do to change that dynamic. We can't, no problem was ever solved from the level of consciousness that created it. And the consciousness of fear and greed and timidity and intimidation and all of these things are not going to allow us to move forward. We're going to have to find a way, and in this sense it truly is a spiritual test as a people, to say no to that kind of greed and also no to that kind of fear. And that's why I think that so many people who have come forward and with these sort of breakthroughs, when they do it and they're a small group that's relatively obscure, that doesn't even know that there's this big buzzsaw out there that's going to chop them up, they think that they've got the world by the world by the tail, and it turns out it's the tiger by the tail that comes around and bites them. And what ends up happening, unfortunately, is they don't really know that that's what they're up against until it's too late. What we're trying to do is get ahead of the curve, provide an umbrella of security and disclosure to any inventor who may have these sort of technologies. But also, ideally, what we need to do is develop our own facility that we have under our control, and which has an ethical agenda that's very clear of not being bought out and not being suppressed. And that's the leadership that's required, and that's the leadership we have team to do this. And that is, many people think that's very untangible, but it's actually the big missing ingredient in all of this. There have been, in fact, we have someone that we know who's worked at the patent office that has said that there's somewhere in a neighborhood of 4,000 patents that have been seized or suppressed because they have information like this in them. And that we certainly know of for a fact that some of the biggest breakthroughs that even Stan Meyer had were hit with national security orders, and he was intimidated enough to comply with it, when what he should have done is raise bloody hell and dump that information out into the Internet or into the public domain, because the interests that were keeping this secret were not looking out after the national security interests of the United States.
In spite of what they were claiming.
Despite what they claim, what they were actually doing is that they were pimping for or were an agency of these large transnational corporate and financial interests that do not want something to be a true competitor with the paradigm of fossil fuel and oil and gas and coal and nuclear power. And I think that these centralized utilities and centralized energy and centralized economic cartels really have more power than people realize, and the corrupting influence of them was actually forewarned by Thomas Jefferson. If you read the early works of Thomas Jefferson, of course, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. I'm sitting here right now just a few miles from Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, and what I find when I read Thomas Jefferson is that he very presciently foresaw the corrupting influence of big financial and corporate interest in the democracy. And of course, then later, Eisenhower warned of the corrupting influence of the military-industrial complex and the secret power that was being acquired in the 1950s. So there's a long history of warning, and there's a long provable history of these things coming and then disappearing. And if one studies this history, one has to reach a few conclusions. Number one, that the science is real and that these technologies have existed and have been developed. Number two, they have never reached the public or the masses. And number three, the reason for it is the dynamic that we've just outlined of abuse of power and corruption. And therefore, number 4 is that we have to create an entirely new strategic initiative to bring these technologies out. And that's what the OrionProject.org is about.
Yes, excellent summary. I wanted to point out, as you were speaking there, there's been other examples and other ways that this types of information has been suppressed, and I'm thinking of one T. Townsend Brown or Thomas Brown, who as a student, brilliant young student experimenter back in the 20s, had done a whole bunch of experiments with charge capacitors and other technology, playing with the concept of anti-gravity. Actually, his work was based upon work from people in the 1918s or 1900s or the teens. So the concept of something anti-gravity, use anti-gravity as a general term here, or counter-gravity terminology. Townsend Brown as when he was in college, tried to interest his professors, including some very famous physicists, in what he was doing, and he was basically told that this had no role in academia, and therefore he should not be putting his effort into this stuff, and it was a bunch of hook'em, and this by a very famous physicist who happened to be one of his professors out in one of the California universities. He finally went back to a university in Ohio. He was from Ohio originally, and he ran into his professor there, a physics professor, a man by the name of Beefield, who did listen ultimately to what he was saying, and it ultimately some of his research became known as the Beefield-Brown effect that he had sort of discovered. Now, where did his information go? This is about, again, another method that knowledge such as this gets buried. Indeed, he was involved with the Navy, worked as part of the Naval Research Labs for a number of years, and essentially his information, which was for a while public, suddenly all disappeared in the early 1950s, and that's well documented. His Project Winter Haven in Hawaii in the early 1950s, demonstrating this principle of propulsion using highly charged capacitor devices. Whereas it was known publicly at that time where that went, what happened to that information totally disappeared in the mid-1950s, and has basically re-emerged through the Disclosure Project witnesses that it was taken underground, developed extensively into literally a flying craft, man-made anti-gravity type craft, or that we have available today. So that's another way in which here's a technology that would have had a tremendous impact on our energy capabilities on the planet being totally suppressed by a small group of people.
I met with a man who was at Norton Air Force Base back, I believe it was in the 80s, who saw 3 of these what are called alien reproduction vehicles, or ARVs, that look like a disc-shaped circular anti-gravity that were completely man-made. And one was about 25 feet in diameter. The medium-sized one was around 50, and then there was a big one that was about 100 feet across. And that these craft were simply hovering silently above the ground floor of this huge hangar at Norton Air Force Base. And I actually have the schematics and drawings that were subsequently made of this, and people who have dealt with that. I've also met people who have piloted these objects. Now, these were actually being studied, as Dr. Loder mentioned, in the 40s and 50s, but were fully operational by the late 50s and 60s, and were being flown. And a lot of people don't realize that about the time that President Eisenhower inaugurated the Eisenhower interstate system that we all drive on, we didn't need interstate roads because we didn't need surface travel between cities. So, I mean, it sounds like people laugh, it sounds like the Jetsons. And I said, well, in point of fact, these sort of silent, floating, hovering things were fully operational by the late 50s and 60s. And we have a senior scientist who's currently working in the largest Department of Defense lab now, and is one of the senior scientists there, who has confirmed to me that he has been through the archives and can actually date it to October of 1954, when everything related to this went deep black and was compartmented away from even access to oversight committees in the Congress or the President or anyone else. And so, I was born in 1955. I'm no spring chicken. And you looked at a year before I was born, it is now pretty well certain that these things were developed and they were functional. And moreover, Dr. Loder and I have visited the laboratory of a man out west who actually worked on the coils of these in the 1960s and has admitted this to us privately and does not want to talk about it publicly, but who is a brilliant electromagnetic engineer and actually helped build these anti-gravity systems. Now, one of the interesting just side notes that I learned from talking to one of the people who had actually seen these devices is that the early ones, these sort of like early sport model ones, as they call them, that look like flying saucers, and I think many so-called UFO sightings that people see are not extraterrestrial in origin. They're actually man-made objects that people confuse with the actual ET craft, which are quite much more developed, actually, and are usually not even fully materialized when they're moving around our atmosphere. But that's another discussion. But these particular objects were large, they were heavy, they weighed tons. It's not like they were made out of tinfoil. But their power-up system was a deep cycle marine battery. That's all they had. They were, in other words, they had a startup DC marine battery, deep cycle marine battery that went in, and the coils and the system went, quote, over unity. It began to pull energy out of this, whatever you wish to call it, quantum vacuum or zero-point energy field, and then through a series of other technologies that Townsend Brown and others had worked on, created lift and hover and a sort of mass cancellation at certain higher energy levels and frequencies. But the initiating power source, that's all it was. and that this was one of the astonishing things to behold, is that you had these things that were hovering and silently, and all that it took to kind of crank them up was, a deep cycle marine battery.
Yeah, it's quite amazing. It's when you start talking to some of these people who actually worked on these things, you realize there's been an entirely different world in the covert projects and the hidden from the average person. We continually hear scientists say, "Oh, that couldn't possibly be anything that we have in our stable of aerial devices. That's impossible. It couldn't be any of ours." When in reality, some of these things are very man-made because the technologies have been around for 50-plus years, which most people have absolutely no idea.
Yeah,
that's indeed the case.
Perhaps longer. I mean,
or longer.
Things like the Philadelphia experiment and others that dealt with all kinds of weird electromagnetic effects that go back into the
That's another area where
30s and 40s
worked.
that deal with other things such as teleportation or dematerialization and other things. And I think that this is one of the tragedies of all this, of course, since the sort of the theme of this today's discussion is the lost century. I think that'd be a great title for a book, actually, on this new energy issue, is the lost century. Is that, from the early 1900s to now, which is 100 years plus and counting, is that the mainstream scientific and the universities and scientists really have not had a proper education, number one, and number two, have not had access to this knowledge because it is actively suppressed and kept out of those circles. I mean, even people that I know you, Ted, have met with who have been senior people at NASA, have pulled you aside and said, yeah, well, we really can't talk about this, but we know it exists.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I've heard this from numerous people, and I think that this is one of the problems is that you could have a PhD from MIT, Caltech, and 10 other top drawer schools and never be exposed to either the correct mathematical formula or theoretical basis or applied physics for any of this. And this is something which is one of the things that Dr. Bearden talks about a great deal, and that is the need for an entirely new educational initiative on these sciences.
That's correct.
Because we are miseducating our young engineers and scientists very seriously.
Yeah, there's basically been essentially 4 generations of electrical engineers and scientists who have been taught a subset of the equations that describe energy relationships. And that's been so long that, of course, the professors, their professors and their professors taught them this subset. And so it's become, quote, truth after several generations, and when in reality there's a lot missing there.
Well, there really is a parallel universe of science and technology classified projects that deal with this. And it's easy to dismiss it. I mean, many people say, well, if any of this were true, I would know about it because I'm a professor at MIT, or I'm a government official at the Department of Energy, or I'm a CIA official. But that isn't how the system works. And what you find is that, when I was briefing President Clinton's first CIA director on a lot of these issues, is that it didn't matter that he answered to the President of the United States and was himself the CIA director, and his wife was the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences. Their inquiries into these matters led to nowhere, led to them basically being brushed off or told to go away. And so, if that's the case for the sitting director of Central Intelligence, how much more so for someone who's getting their PhD in physics or engineering at MIT or Caltech? So I think that there is this sort of naivete that exists out there that, this sort of information would just be very easily obtained if it were true. And that's also one of the big myths that the media skeptics and the debunkers like to put out there, though, the government can't keep a secret. And then perhaps they're correct in terms of the conventional government. But when you're talking about these transnational corporate and other interests, they can keep a secret. Nobody has the code for Microsoft's programming. Nobody has the formula for Coca-Cola. And I can tell you that this is more important than Microsoft and Coca-Cola put together.
Correct.
Full stop. So there is this naivete and sort of that exists, and this sort of assumption. Now, this, of course, brings up the reason for senior members of the Congress that I have met with not having access. I mean, even if they're on an oversight committee that is an oversight committee for NASA or the Department of Energy or the Senate Intelligence Committee, these people are not told of these things. And the reason they're not is that they wouldn't stand for such wondrous and fantastic breakthroughs in science, which in many cases have been funded by black budget funds from our Treasury, being kept from the public. And while we mush around trying to do cap and trade and multi-trillion-dollar solutions to the fossil fuel problem, when there's a solution that exists in a classified project and has for decades. So they're not going to be told about it because while there probably are a few members of this so-called majestic group that has kept many of these things secret who are in the Congress, the vast majority of members of Congress and people in the White House and executive branch and Department of Defense and CIA are not privy to this, and they don't want them to be because they know that they wouldn't stand for the secrecy. So this is part of the dysfunction of what Eisenhower talked about the unwarranted power, I'm quoting here, that would be amassed by a secretive military-industrial complex that would accumulate too much power and make things very secretive. And I think that what we have to do is realize that the OrionProject.org is an attempt to get the public educated on this, but also be a funding mechanism. So far, we've provided some grant funding to people who are working just sort of out of their garages and little labs on their own. But realistically, in order to get the kind of breakthroughs we're looking for, we're either going to have to get real lucky and have someone come forward who has already built one of these things that's fully operational that can be carried forward by us strategically, so it makes it through all these strategic hurdles of suppression and co-optation and purchasing of it and putting it on a black shelf and all the things I've outlined. Or we have to be able to open our own facility where we put the best scientists and engineers who know of this sort of area of science and begin to do some experimentation and development, or true basic research and development, R&D, under very well-controlled circumstances where they're protected and where they're adequately supplied with the right materials and the right equipment and laboratory equipment and analyzers and all these sorts of things, so that they can come up with these on their own. Either way would work, but you're not going to be able to create a research and development facility around these sciences without having some significant level of funding. And when I say significant, I mean about what, I tell people this story just to put things in a little bit of perspective. I was walking down a street in Washington, D.C. This summer, and I looked up and there was a plywood sign that was announcing a road project that they were doing. And they were basically taking an island, a concrete island, out of the middle of an intersection and changing the traffic flow for this minor intersection in Washington in one of the neighborhoods. And that was a $4.1 million project. That's what it said on the sign, of U.S. taxpayer dollar and D.C. government, but most of it was U.S. taxpayer. Now, our entire budget to start a research and development facility here near the University of Virginia, which is the top public university in the United States, and 2 hours from Washington, where we'd have access to all sorts of talent strategically, is about $3.1 million. So $1 million less than taking an island out of an intersection in a neighborhood in Washington. Now, one of the things that we have to do is say, look, we are certainly needing to have at least that level of support in order to do this. And it's a very modest request, really. But so far we haven't raised it. We're hoping those of you listening will contribute, and also will find other people, perhaps people who can be educated on these sciences. And, if there's a serious larger funding source that anyone out there knows, I'm sure Dr. Loder and myself would be happy to discuss this with them and meet with them if they have a serious interest. The science is certainly there. The history of it is there. The physics have been worked out. But you have to have an operational device, and to have an operational device means that someone makes it through this buzzsaw and develops it and can sort of cooperate with us in moving it out with it fully operational, or we have to go back and do this sort of not from scratch, because there's a whole lot of work that's been done, but has to be done with some R&D and try to recreate this. Now, the good news is that we wouldn't be starting from scratch, and this is one of the things that maybe, Ted, you can mention a little bit about the sorts of technologies that we have had the advantage of learning about, but also that there are expired patents and other things that could be a sort of a template from which we could then have a sort of a springboard to develop these technologies.
Well, certainly some of the work that Stan Meyer did with his breaking apart water, using highly efficient methods of breaking apart water into what's known as Brown's gas or hydroxy gas, which then can be recombined to put out a lot of energy. That is, there's massive amounts of evidence that indeed he was doing this. We have seen his technology. We have talked to the people who worked with it extensively, et cetera. So that's certainly one area. And as you mentioned, this patent, which has just come to our attention within the last week or so, does some of the same types of things. So there is but it's going to take a group of people to sit down, study both the technology, the physical technology, as well as the patents and the documents that describe it, to come up with an optimal way of doing it. It's not like one of these things is sitting there, you turn the on button and away you go. It's really truly not that easy. Or Stan Meyer would have been selling the thing to everybody on the street, and that hadn't happened yet. So that's certainly one type of technology. Other technology, we're working with people who have claimed, anyway, to have reproduced some of the concepts of Tesla in extracting scalar energy from batteries and coils and what have you, to produce a basically non-moving part, only moving magnetic fields, using very little amount of energy to move electromagnetic fields. When you move a magnetic field and you have a coil of wire within that field, and the field is oscillating or vibrating, if you will, electrons flow and you produce electricity. So we're hopefully working with a group, or we are working with a group, waiting for them to complete their technology. So those are two areas. We're also working with several groups who are working with moving, we'll call them magnetic motor generators, in which things are rotating, magnets are rotating, coils are there producing power. But a lot of them are sort of very efficient motors at this point, but doing the breakthrough of producing more power out than in seems to be the elusive butterfly for many of these inventors at this point.
We know it has been done, however, and this is the issue, is that one of the problems is that you have a lot of people working alone, and they keep recreating the wheel and hitting the building blocks, and they need to have a diverse, interdisciplinary group of physicists, scientists, engineers, project management, materials specialists who know what kind of specialized materials could be used that would help facilitate these sorts of effects and maximize them. All of that needs to be put together under one roof. And I think that when I've said before that what we're calling for really here through the OrionProject.org is a sort of peaceful Manhattan Project that would be supported by the public who have learned of these new energy possibilities and studied the history of it, is exactly that. And I don't think it's something that's going to require billions, and I don't even think tens of millions to get to some very serious breakthroughs, because we know we're not dealing with something that is new. We know this is something that has been done since at least the early 1900s. And keeps getting reinvented by people and rediscovered by people, only to vanish into the black pit of Calcutta of energy suppression and threats, and also the purchasing of them in many cases, with them subsequently being black shelved, put on a shelf and then suppressed. And I mean, Dr. Loder and I have personally met with many people who have either been witnessed this or actually been victims of this kind of behavior. And this is a big part of one of the problems, is that there is an element here where there's a lot of courage needed in order to move to this next level. And that courage is one where you have to be willing to stand up to the enormous pressures that are brought to bear to prevent these types of technologies from getting out and known to the public on a large scale. I mean, in the past, there have been a few people who hear of these things, and they begin to surface, and then they just sort of mysteriously vanish, and or the person disappears, or the person is bought off, or what have you. And I think that this is why the people listening need to understand this is a message of empowerment, that they can not only go to the OrionProject.org and provide funding to us and contributions, but they can also educate other people about this so that when a breakthrough like this begins to emerge and we identify someone who has something, it can be virally spread like wildfire around the world on the Internet and through word of mouth. And this is a very important thing, because what we want to do is not only to support the engineers and scientists who have these technologies or develop them independently by having a facility here, but when we do, squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube so vigorously that it cannot be put back in. And I think that this is a very simple strategy, and that is that in the past, many of these breakthroughs have been by obscure scientists or obscure inventors working alone. And the consequence of that is that they have not had the strategic network that we have developed over the last 19 years to get this out in front of millions of people, to put it in front of friendly people in the Congress, and I might add in the White House, to get large numbers of financial people who, while not stepping up yet to fund these things experimentally, would certainly throw their hat in the ring if we had something operational, that this is something we have pre-existing, ready to go. And that is something that's a very unique aspect of the OrionProject.org. And another part of it is that to those of you listening at the World Puja Network, and I thank the World Puja Network for hosting us here, can share this interview and information on the Internet with others so that everyone is prepared for this and begin to support it. Because really the first shield that we'll all have to have is the support of the public. And that's why this is an important grassroots effort as well.
That is correct. I'd like to I'd like to add a couple comments at this point. How do you find out more information about what we're speaking? One thing, the Orion Project, that's one word, the OrionProject.org, has a number of papers on it that you can read. They're easily readable by the general public. Some are more so or not, but under both the latest news and under the research sections on the OrionProject.org, you can find some background information about what we've spoken, some of Tom Bearden's background information and others. A couple books that I might mention here which also provide a more in-depth view of things. Gene Manning and Joel Garben recently have written a book just within the past year or so called Breakthrough Power. And this deals with many of the technologies and some we haven't even mentioned and a bit of a history about them. One other book to mention, which is almost impossible to get a hold of, even though it was only written 10 years ago, it's out of print and very difficult to find, is a book called Lost Science. Now, Steve, Dr. Greer mentioned maybe we should have a book called Lost Century. This is called Lost Science by Jerry, that's with a G, Vassilatos. And it is an in-depth research review of people like Tesla, like T. Townsend Brown and others. It's fascinating. Fascinating background. And Nathan Stubblefield, another person we haven't spoken at, Thomas Moray, Philo Farnsworth, who invented the TV. All of these people were working in energy technologies that are just amazing. So that's a couple places where you can get more information.
Very good. Thanks for sharing that. Well, I think we're out of time, and I'd like to thank Dr. Loder for sharing his time with us today and his expertise and knowledge and wealth of knowledge, and the World Fusion Network for hosting us. If you want more information, please go to the Orion Project, all one word, .org, and see what we're doing. And I look forward to speaking to you later on another Conversations with Dr. Greer. Thanks again, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.